enough, as important and critical as it is to everything else. It isn't enough, because if it was enough, my brother would be alive and we wouldn't have to emphasize the importance of adherence, compliance,
Yeah.
going to your checkups, getting tested. If the medicine was enough, we wouldn't have to do all that. So I appreciate the, skepticism of, some placebo that's supposed to help your eyesight or whatever. And I get that, but I would push back on people in pharma totally rolling their eyes over the word holistic, because
Mm.
then we're just in a semantics conversation. We have to appreciate that this is more than just medicine.
Yeah.
And if you want your patients to be healthy, and if you want your medicine to be sold and taken over a long period of time, it is in your best business interest to care about those other elements.
So you know what medical science liaisons are. We've talked a little bit about that, and that they typically work with healthcare professionals and then sort of bring the patient voice via the healthcare professionals back to pharmaceutical companies. And I'm wondering if there's a gap that we need to explore a little bit around how MSLs could potentially work better with patients, or patient consultants like yourself, or even patient advocacy groups, to get a more authentic patient voice to bring back to pharmaceutical companies. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I agree with that, and to me, there's two prongs. There's how are MSLs taking into account the insights from the lived experience experts, the patients,
Mhm.
because they're going to report differently than the physicians. So not including those insights in what goes back to the company is a gap. And I think it's a gap that's easily enough met. The other prong, though, that I think is worth thinking about is how can either those MSLs or through a different department, though that would probably be more of a heavy lift, how can their expertise be leveraged to help patient advocates and patient communities better understand the key scientific characteristics that differentiate treatment A from treatment B? Because with hemophilia, when all we had was plasma-derived factor replacement therapy, that, well, I shouldn't say all we had. Technically, we still had cryoprecipitate. Technically, you could still use fresh frozen plasma if you'd like. But from a standard of care perspective, there was one gold standard treatment option. So the need to understand the nuances of the mechanism of action, the hemostatic system, nascently wasn't necessary. But now that we have mimetics, gene therapeutics, these non-factor rebalancing agents that are targeting different parts of the coagulation cascade, there is an increased need to make sure that the patient, or in the pediatric settings, the caregiver, and to the best they can, the patient, understand what their options truly are, because there is no such thing as personalized medicine or optimized medicine or shared decision making if we continue to focus solely on the HCPs being able to absorb what this new treatment is and how it may play into the lives of their patients. We have come to, it seems, in hemophilia anyway, the degree to which it's spoken about, universally accept shared decision making, having both the HCP and the patient as well informed as possible, so that 7 or 8 minute dynamic conversation about a treatment option is as well informed as it can be. If we continually only focus on the HCP, especially for new therapies, well, then we're not setting our patient community up for success. They can't engage meaningfully in shared decision making if we're not making the same effort to make sure that by the time they walk in, not after they walk in, before they walk in, they have the opportunity to learn as much as they can in a way that is translated for their level of education and grasp, which is different than an HCP. So I think there's two prongs. How can these MSLs take the patient insights into account, because they will be unique from the HCP insights, and bring those back to the pharma company? But then how can the expertise and skills of those MSLs also be leveraged so that we're increasing the knowledge base of the patient community separate from the HCPs?
And how do you think so? I mean, we talked last time about the many new disease categories and how confusing it would be for a lot of patients, right? Not everyone is as empowered and knowledgeable as you are about the treatment landscape and the pipeline. Um, how do you think most people are finding this information out now? How do they learn about pipeline and new treatments coming out?
From my experience, for those who are active online, who are active in the closed Facebook groups, that's where a lot of it takes place. But on other social media platforms as well, you see articles and PR and reports on presentations from ISTH or whatnot. They come through on those platforms. So there's a certain amount of people who are learning that way. And I know many of those people, and they have leadership roles as well. So then they will learn that way, and then they can take that forward to their patients or their clients or whoever their network is. The patient meetings, both virtual and virtual and live meetings, still seem to be the place that a lot of people come to, ready with the questions that are on their mind, or to present their particular situation to look for some insight. So I don't think we're ever going to lose the importance of having those rooms, which often have a mix of patients, caregivers, providers of various expertise, hematologists, nurses. So those can be really wonderful discussions during family education weekends or the like. Um, I'd say those are probably the two that come to mind most commonly. Of course, with our podcast, that we produce a lot of podcasts, but one in particular is intended to keep a finger on the pulse and what's just been released from clinical trials. Has there been some sort of safety notice that we need to help amplify? And I get the feedback. I know the podcast for a number of people is a primary source as well. So those social media groups, the live and online education days, education weekends, webinars, events, and then the podcast. I mean, I'll pat myself on the back, I guess, a little bit for that.
Good. Um, just in terms of like this on the social media, like in the communities or at the virtual events, who is contextualizing this scientific information for patients to help them understand? Because this is the role of MSLs for physicians, right? They are bringing that, like, what does this mean for my practice? Here's the data. What does it mean for your practice? Who does that for patients now?
Well, in the online setting, it's a lot of other patients and caregivers, which is not dissimilar from what happens in the hallways and over the lunch tables live at family education meetings as well. Peer-to-peer exchanging of information is a very influential um, way to push information forward through a peer. That said, I do share concern with others that if people may be lived experienced experts, but I'm not a scientific or a medical expert. So if I start chiming in with, well, the reason that's this is this, da 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 da, based on my lived experience, now we're starting to venture into problematic territory. So that is a concern. That said, there are professionals who are in these groups as well, and I do see them chime in and clarify or add further context. So there's a certain amount of, I don't know what to, it's almost like a small town meritocracy, and everyone's kind of as best they can contributing to try to understand the thing. I don't know that it's the cleanest or the smoothest way to push information along, but I think in lieu of there being something that more directly helped patients and caregivers understand developing science, new treatment options and mechanisms of action and the key characteristics, I think in lieu of something that was the gold standard place to go, it makes a lot of sense to me that these conversations would take place, at least initially, online a lot of times.
Yeah. What about the patient organizations? Do they not? I mean, it's really tricky. I find that sometimes patient organizations they have their fingers in a lot of pies. They have a lot of different agendas, and so sometimes their information comes across as being a bit basic. Like, in other words, they don't cover the mechanism of action. They don't really, risk benefit profile new treatments to a level of depth that maybe an empowered patient would need. Is that your experience
Yeah,
as well?
I think that on the whole, I would agree with that. And then I will add, you will see them host sponsored education from company, which is often very good and well produced and delivered by a professional, and has been because the company does and has put the time and resources into trying to make that as rich as possible. So whereas the patient organization doesn't necessarily have the time and availability to do that across all available treatments in something like, say, hemophilia, the companies do. On the other hand, of course, it is perceived differently if it comes from company as
Mhm.
opposed to what we would envision as a third party patient advocacy organization that's putting my education and advocacy needs first. Patient organizations don't want to be seen as playing favorites. They also certainly don't want to ostracize companies. So I appreciate that from a sort of a business and viability standpoint, they're in a little bit of a tricky position. That said, I don't think that tricky position lets them off the hook from bearing some amount of responsibility themselves for how the patient communities are educated. I don't think it's enough to be simply fundamental or basic,
Mm,
and to supplement that with industry sponsored education. It feels to me like there's room in there
mm,
for the patient organizations to substantiate or better structure how patient organization education is developed and distributed, even if supported from company, it's not their content, right? Even if the
mm.
underwriting comes from companies, this is our content, this is our interpretation, this is our point of view. I think I think there it's an area that needs to be examined, but again, I appreciate that it's nuanced.
It is, and it can be quite tricky because from a regulatory perspective, pharmaceutical companies cannot go and, you know, um, tell patients directly the benefits of their pipeline product that hasn't been approved yet, especially, you know, um, I mean, even in the US, if it's not FDA approved and it doesn't have marketing authorization, no way, right? A patient would have to request a lay summary and then they would have that. But I kind of think like in this realm we operate in, there are clinical trial investigators, there are MSLs, there are, as you said, there are expert hematologists. There are a number of people who would understand the landscape and the specifics around the treatments. Certainly, there's an ideal scenario in there somewhere where patients have access to some of these people who can explain the science behind the treatments, answer questions about what it means for patients, and then this could be then transported to other patients. It seems like there must be not all patients are going to be able to go to a big hematology conferences or medical conferences and get the data, and even then it might go over their heads or they don't have anyone there to sort of put it in patient terms. So, like, ideally, what would that look like? What do you give me some thoughts about what you think would be a good sort of way to help patients learn about this?
So I'm trying to think about how do we learn, right? And how do I learn? How do I advance my knowledge about hemophilia related developments? And let's assume, to your point, I'm not able to attend some live meeting somewhere. So maybe there's a virtual something I can go to, or it's a digital asset, or it's something in my local area. Well, it's probably not something in my local area because I have a rare disease. So if we're striking, the big meetings, then I'm what's available for me online. Maybe there's a webinar of some kind, but I think in general, I like learning by, like a lot of people, watching short videos as a
Mm,
starting place. Give me the visuals, start me somewhere, give me set help me understand what this is through a short 2, 3 minute beginning, middle, and end. What's the key problem we're solving? How do we solve it? What do I need to know? I think the problem is that while the webinar option may allow for me as a patient to say, doctor, I have a question. If what leads up to that moment, like the question has to be based on something that's happened in the last 30 or 40 minutes, right? In the context of the webinar.
Mm.
On the other hand, if I watch this video and I absorb it, I'm thinking about what might this mean for me. Maybe I chat about it with my wife or a friend or a sibling. I am going to have a question once I've had an opportunity to sort of sit with this. So I'm just thinking out loud, but I think before even thinking about the mechanisms, there's the process of new science for a layperson. It's not like I can hear new science and then immediately start asking smart questions, right? I have
No,
to
of course not.
sit with it. Yeah, I have to like understand something. Like, oh, okay, so I get it. So thrombin, okay, now okay, so if that's the case, now I'm ready to ask a question, right? Like I've been able to understand, then I can ask. So I think maybe it's a little bit more of a process. We push out a webinar, a one-off thing. We push out a video, a one-off thing. But maybe we have to appreciate that just like most people need numerous conversations
Mm.
before they start on a new therapy, people need numerous touch points in order to go from I don't know anything about this
Yes.
to I know enough about this to go talk to my doctor. It's not a one-time thing.
No, and it reminds me a lot. So I work in oncology loads, over a decade, but I've helped launch new therapies. Like when the first immunotherapies were coming out, nobody knew what immunotherapy was. Even doctors, they were excited about this potential, using your body's immune system to fight cancer, but nobody really knew how it worked, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I remember Roche had created some very simple, like animated videos to explain. They had really cute cancer cells with little ninja hats on and capes, kind of evading the immune system, like uh, the killer cells. The cancer killer
Mm-hmm.
cells, because cancer is sneaky, and basically kind of showing how immunotherapy sort of helped your killer cells see the cancer cells better, right? And it was almost oversimplified, but it was very cute and well done. And I think
Mm-hmm.
people got it. You could watch that video like a minute and a half, and you're like, ah, okay, now I know what immunotherapy does. Now, what does your immunotherapy do? As opposed to the one released by your competitors. So yours is a
Right.
PDL1 and theirs is a PD1. What does that mean? What's PD1 and PDL1? Do you know what I mean? And then you had to
Mm-hmm.
sort of baby step into it a little bit, but with enough short form content, you could get there. And then you would have,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, you'd be able to ask those smart questions because it's like, okay, I have a basis of understanding now of what this treatment type is, what the mechanism of action is for it, what differentiates treatment A from treatment B. Maybe some of the things around safety concerns. Okay, well, what does this do that that one doesn't do? What are my risks? What are the benefits and what are the risks? Then you can start to ask questions. I mean, I think this is sort of the path forward, isn't it? A little bit.
Yeah, because as I listen to you talk that through, I'm not going to have safety. I'm not going to ask questions about safety concerns if I am not at a point where I'm actually even on some level considering this. Like
Mm,
I'm not getting there right away. I'm not going to hear about it. My first question isn't going to be about safety. My first question is like, how does this work?
mm,
Okay, how often do I have to take it? How burdensome is it to take it? Am I going to be able to get this? Is my insurance going to fight this in any way? Like there's a series of questions I think before I would even get to safety because if those other things, well, I don't know if that's fair because I guess my assumption is if we're having the conversation to begin with, the basic answer to is this product safe is yes. I think I'm just assuming that off the top, or we're not even in this conversation. So by the time I'm actually drilling down on where my safety concerns are, I have started to think about this on a more intimate level, which means I have to have had a certain amount of understanding of what is this foundationally, how is it different, why would I consider it. Okay, now those wheels are starting to turn, Now I want to know more. So I'm supporting your thesis. I think it does start with that foundational work, but then the comment that I'm making about these sometimes excellent videos is when they end, well, then where do you go next? Because it's
Exactly.
not as though, and then the doctor walks in like that. So what do you do next to take the insights from that video and start to filter them through? What does this mean for me, and who do I ask about what? And being able to strategically lay that out. It's a series of short form content with a wraparound campaign. Maybe there is a final meet the doctor live on said date. So if people watch the series over the 3 months leading up or whatever, or the 3 weeks, if you want to meet, these fancy doctors on this day, there is this live opportunity. And then, oh, by the way, the recording will be available. Then we're going to show you a thing at the next big live meeting. Because I think that's another piece of it, right? Again, people, it's not, you don't hear something once and then act. People need multiple opportunities to hear about something, learn about it, consider it. So no one tactic is going to meet this gap. It needs to be a strategically thought out series of activities, campaign of content and messages. And then even still there will be gaps because we won't reach everybody. But that's that isn't happening currently. I don't see that happening currently. With gene therapy, with AAV gene therapy a few years ago, there was some of that happening in pronounced ways because
Mm.
multiple companies had big interests in trying to educate on this headline grabbing new product class. We've seen that fade, and still people have questions about how does AAV gene therapy work, which just reinforces the need to
Yeah.
educate, 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 educate.
Yeah. It doesn't, so the campaign doesn't have it doesn't have a journey, right? And I find this is like a huge problem in just like the pharmaceutical industry, just in general. It's like, oh, I've seen a press release or I've seen a data release, right? But it goes nowhere. It leads to the corporate side or it leads somewhere. And it's like even doctors can't really figure out, okay, where do I go to find out more information? But they have the MSLs they can reach out to. Patients don't really have anyone to reach out to unless there is something, like you said, a webinar that's already set up with some experts who will contextualize this new information for you and answer your questions, right? And then not everyone wants to watch a webinar, so then you almost need like a webinar summary. Where you kind of put this into, a carousel and pop it on social media so that people can kind of grasp the, you know, in 7 slides, what does this mean? And then you have a
Correct.
follow on, like at a live event, like you were talking about, at an educational event, where they can then still find out more and ask questions and hear people discussing it, in a panel or whatever. I mean, it needs to sort of live for a time, especially around sort of that commercialization route, where it's coming to market, it's going to be available. Yes, you can assume that you may have some access issues initially, but that will be ironed out eventually. Um,
And here's who you can speak to, at company to help you with those. I
mm,
have faced those and actually specifically have had people at Sanofi help me with access related issues.
mm,
So it's and to speak specifically to Sanofi, so for example, they have in the US anyway, these core managers, so these community relations managers, and those are the people who are going to the events, engaging and educating. The issue that or not issue, the challenge is that I don't think oftentimes what makes these folks excellent at the job, from my perception, the way it seems currently the job, doesn't necessarily mean that they are the right people for this higher level translational science work.
mm,
I feel like more often than not, I would hear, I can connect you with my colleague, which is great. But ideally, I'd love to hear it from you. I'd love the one person who I deal with. If you're the community relations person, if you're my
mm,
person at company, ideally, you would be able to give me 90% of what
mm.
I need so that it's only once I'm maybe deeper in my consideration process and have some really technical questions
Yep.
that we have to set up a call with another person and there'll be an e-introduction, and it's not the biggest deal to say, let me connect you to my colleague. but I do seek to reduce the number of clicks or passes,
Mm.
because I just know as an individual, it may not be a big deal for the dentist to say, call me back Tuesday to make the appointment, but I probably won't call back on Tuesday, to be honest with you. I'm on the phone now. So
Yeah.
how much can you do for me now? How much can these community relations people, like how can they in the MSLs together work on, here are the top 3 to 5, key things that we want to make sure. And I imagine this is already happening.
Mm.
How can it be amplified or accelerated in some way? Because they do have some infrastructure for helping people connect to information. They have these MSLs and they have these community relations managers. I think it's how do we connect the activities of these two groups a little bit more closely for the benefit of patient literacy.
Yeah. And also create those feedback loops for them so that the core members should be circling back to the MSLs and saying, these are the questions I'm getting, these are the
Actually, that's a
concerns.
fantastic point. And these are like, if it could be tied as well to feedback on what people would love to see future research, future studies examining. There's and that's also, I think, a good way to incentivize the advocacy groups to support this kind of initiative, because one of the big pushes, again, at least here in the United States, is how do we get the patient community more actively engaged in research, preclinical, clinical. How do we make sure that we are enrolling all patients affected by hemophilia, so that we don't have women who are then saying, well, we don't have any research on this product in women, and it's like, well, it's because you don't enroll women in the study, and then you say I can't because there's no. So we're just like the Spider-Man meme, just pointing at each other going, where's the problem? So I think if we can tap into, there's a feedback loop that will give you information on what the patient community is thinking about with regard to product and safety, as well as where they would love to see future research go. The areas that they don't hear people talking about, the parts of their lives that are not made better by the advancements that come out. Um, that, like, if I was also asked about that as a patient, I was like, wow, they really care. They're not just trying to educate me on their thing to hope that maybe I'm a customer for it, but they want to learn more about me so that if there's something that's not getting met, they can try to meet that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the sort of integrated approach, right? That a lot of diseases are moving into, cancer specifically, but IBD, I heard a lot as well from the patients that we worked with, saying that, medication may be foundational, but it's not going to solve your inflammation, for instance, necessarily.
Right.
And so you've got to do all of these additional things to sort of approach the disease in a more holistic way. And I know holistic is not a necessarily a term that pharma likes to use, because they tend to think a lot of, like pseudoscience, unproven supplements, people doing green smoothies to take, to address their disease. But I mean, it's people do what they think they need to do to support what the medication does. And also the medication comes with side effects, and some of us are dealing with quite harsh ones as well. And so you're trying to like do the good things to help your body deal with the bad things.
Yeah, and the impact, holistic encompasses the total person and the total impact of disease.
Mm,
So, I think I may have shared this previously, but, my brother passes away not because there isn't factor medication, not because there isn't factor medication that's available to him. It's in a duffel bag under his bed where he
mm,
was sleeping with a head bleed. But because my brother did not take seriously enough his need to stay on prophylaxis and self care, because there was a psychological burden
no,
to his adherence to the medication, it cost him his life. So the medicine isn't enough, as important and critical as it is to everything else. It isn't enough, because if it was enough, my brother would be alive and we wouldn't have to emphasize the importance of adherence, compliance,
no,
going to your checkups, getting tested. If the medicine was enough, we wouldn't have to do all that. So I appreciate the, skepticism of, some placebo that's supposed to help your eyesight or whatever. And I get that, but I would push back on people in pharma totally rolling their eyes over the word holistic, because
mm,
then we're just in a semantics conversation. we have to appreciate that this is more than just medicine.
Yeah,
And if you want your patients to be healthy, and if you want your medicine to be sold and taken over a long period of time, it is in your best business interest to care about those other elements.
absolutely. And mindset is one of the things that I hear over and over as well. It's like I work with advanced cancer patients, and tell someone they have stage 4 cancer and that there's nothing in standard of care to help them, and watch where someone's mind goes. It's
Right.
it's tough going, but it also, like, for the people that persevere, I've really seen that they are able to find solutions when they're told that there are none. It's like those people that they say you'll never walk again, and some people just go like, okay, I'll never walk again. And then some people like give you the finger and say like, watch me. Do you know what I mean? And so
Yep.
some of that has to be addressed, I think, because otherwise you are going to have people that just say, oh, it's too hard, I'm going to drop off, the side effects are too much, I can't do this. And then that's it. It won't matter how much medication they have, because they won't take it. So
And they won't necessarily tell us any of this. They'll
no,
just stop.
they'll
They'll
just stop.
just stop doing things. So if we don't listen, if we're not cultivating the opportunities for feedback, to actively listen, to appreciate the total experience of the patient and how to make that better, then we just risk losing them and never actually knowing what happens.
Exactly, exactly. Well, I have taken up enough of your time.